A growing body of evidence shows U.S. government officials, agencies, and contractors are demanding Facebook and Twitter censor ordinary Americans, according to friend of the show and Twitter Files author Michael Schellenberger. And in his latest reporting, he explains how an influential censorship advocate has admitted that she worked for the CIA. According to the report, since December, a small but growing group of journalists, analysts, and researchers have documented the rise of a censorship industrial complex or network of U.S. government agencies and government-funded think tanks. He goes on. Over the last 6 years, these entities have coordinated their efforts to both spread disinformation and to censor journalists, politicians, and ordinary Americans. And a key figure in this story, Renee DiResta, research manager of the Stanford Internet Observatory. DiResta has more than anyone else made the public case for greater government-led and government-funded censorship, writing for the New York Times, The Atlantic, Wired, and other major publications, and through public speaking, including on podcasts with Joe Rogan and Sam Harris.
Here's Schellenberger on the Joe Rogan Experience explaining the background of his report on government censorship.
Agency I mentioned, that part of the Department of Homeland Security, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, they changed their website over the last few months to remove references to domestic counter disinformation efforts, to emphasize countering foreign disinformation. They, we talk a lot about this. There's one of the big leaders of the censorship industrial complex is this person named Renee DiResta at Stanford Internet Observatory who you had on.
Let's talk about that because I had her on, and what she essentially was talking about was all these Russian troll farms and how interesting it is that they created all these funny memes and they used all these resources to try to shift the narrative and change public opinion on certain things, and that it was very effective.
Here's more about Renee DiResta herself.
In 2017, she is at a consulting firm called New Knowledge that is then caught doing disinformation against an Alabama Trumpian Republican candidate named Roy Moore. They are caught doing fake Facebook pages, accusing Roy Moore of wanting to basically restrict alcohol consumption in Alabama, which is a deeply unpopular position that was false, and also creating the perception of Russian bots supporting Roy Moore. Her firm runs that campaign. Afterwards, she sort of tries to distance herself from it, suggests that she wasn't involved, even though when you read the Washington Post and New York Times articles about her, about the scandal, it makes it clear that she was actually the person that brought the funding in to run the program and also kind of conceived much of the strategy. After that, she becomes the top researcher to the Senate Intelligence Report of 2018 on Russian disinformation in the 2016 election. So she's not only is she not punished for her role in it, she's rewarded by the Democrats with this incredibly powerful position.
Roy Moore's Alabama campaign, of course, also dragged down by accusations of pedophilia. Now, DiResta responded to Schellenberger's comments on Rogan and her connection to the CIA, saying, "My purported secret agent double life was in an undergraduate student fellowship at CIA ending in 2004, years prior to Twitter's founding. I've had no affiliation since." So, Robbie, what do you make of all of this? It does seem like it's perfectly reasonable to think that DiResta is someone who maybe made too much of Russian troll farms, who bought into the Democratic narrative that wanted to blame Russia for Hillary Clinton's own strategic failures and her 2016 loss, that she has a pedigree that is very much in line with kind of mainstream corporate libs, et cetera, without there being this accusation that because she did an internship at the CIA, that somehow speaks to a connectedness, an official connection between those intelligence agencies and the kind of censorship that we've seen in the Twitter files. What do you make of it?
Well, obviously, there's nothing you can do but speculate about whether she has ongoing CIA ties. Certainly, we know that actually there were employees, very senior employees of companies like Twitter who still had ties to the FBI or had come from the FBI and then were advising the company to adopt moderation policies that were in line with what the FBI was thinking about certain policy issues. Renee DiResta now serves as director of the Stanford Internet Observatory, which manages the Election Integrity Project and also essentially that kind of mutated into the Virality Project, which was constantly in contact with social media companies throughout the pandemic, urging moderation of COVID content. So what I see here, what I think is interesting, is the enormous continuity and transformation between the kind of Russia hacked the election, Russian bots everywhere, election stuff, into COVID disinformation stuff. It's the same cops, and that ought to make you pretty concerned about what they were policing with respect to COVID, because what they were policing with respect to, particularly the 2016 election, did not age well at all. All these narratives that Trump won because of the influence of Russia on Facebook, that has not aged well. That is not supported. In fact, there's been a lot of good political science, social science research that has shown that it's just not the case, that these efforts were much smaller than they were made out to be by researchers like DiResta and by academics and by the media. The efforts were not targeted at the right people, that it was not, and it's not brainwashing. That's, again, we get to this point where they act like it's like a James Bond technology or something. Like if you're exposed to the Russian disinformation, like your eyes go all swirly and you're like, I will vote the way Russia wants. Persuasion doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the major similarity between the disinformation analysis with the COVID stuff versus the 2016 campaign stuff is that they're not pushing back against fake facts. They're not pushing back against untruths on the internet. They're concerned that true statements will have an influence against their own political interests.
Right.
Which is not. That's just life. You
Which
have
is
to deal
in the
with inconvenient
trifecta,
facts.
that's malinformation,
Exactly.
right? And malinformation is
words.
information that's perfectly true, but someone thinks is going to be used in a bad way.
Right. So the prototypical example I always go to, because I got caught in the crossfires of this,
right, the Bernie and black people,
these memes or what have you that were talking about poor behavior on the part of the American government against black Americans. And these liberals ostensibly are saying this is misinformation, this is bad. Russia, it's not fair for Russia to say true things about how black people have been underserved by the Democratic Party and the American government as a whole. No, if you have a concern with that, you've got to address it head on, not rename it and try to ban it from the internet. Whose interest does that actually serve? And it's the same with a lot of what we've learned now about the COVID information, much of which has now been proven to be true about the protectiveness, for example, of having the immunity from having gotten COVID versus the vaccine immunity, and that was, we know from the Twitter files, also attempted to be banned from the internet, banned from Twitter at the very least. So yeah, how is this political faction, however you want to describe them, these centrist liberals, going to get past the idea that they can't just wipe from the internet inconvenient truths that sometimes create obstacles for their electoral successes?
So I think it's important to do the work that Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi and other people are doing to expose the people at this nexus of academic research, federal agencies like the FBI, Homeland Security, State Department, et cetera, and the mainstream media who are pushing out these narratives about the widespread disinformation. Often they're implicitly or explicitly suggesting is of foreign origin. So it has both the national security lens and then the COVID lens. And I think it's important to understand who these people are, how they're being, if to the extent they're being funded by the government, in some cases they're publicly funded. That some of the disinformation trackers and watchdogs I've criticized on the show, who've come after me and other organizations I've worked with, they're State Department funded. These people are not beyond scrutiny, and the pernicious effect they've had on our free speech rights on social media. And the glorifying way they've been described in the mainstream media is the other thing. These people have been lauded as heroes in the New York Times and the Atlantic and on CNN, where they're just, these are the people, the new warriors for the truth who are fighting disinformation in like a kind of, again, a Cold War sense, because they're implying that it's coming from Russia.
Sure. I guess my only pushback to all of this would be, it feels to me like a much deeper cultural issue than just the intelligence agencies. I think the focus on the intelligence agencies is right because they have so much power and influence, and we saw that from the Twitter files. But I think it's almost too narrow to think of it that way. I was listening to a podcast, Jen Briney, she has a podcast called The Congressional Dish, where she goes through the entire congressional record in a level of detail that most people don't do in the media space. And she recently had an episode on the Twitter files where she pointed out that the main takeaway from those hearings, if you look at the kinds of things that the Democrats were saying, not a single one of them seemed to understand that just because Twitter is a private company that technically has the right to censor as it will, that these individuals who seem to think that these government agencies that seem to feel like they have the power, the ability, the right to influence Twitter's censorship regime is a real problem, and that we should be talking about what restrictions should be put on those government agencies, not necessarily vilifying Twitter or any company that's being affected in these kinds of ways. And that what was so dispiriting about watching those the hearings, that none of the Democrats seem to understand that at all. And I think that's part and parcel of this deeper cultural question of why is it that there is such this commitment to one always being right, that the other side can never have a point, that it can never be that you just lost an election because you didn't connect to the people. This persistent refusal to engage with what might have caused Trump to win, other than Russia in 2016. It's a deeper illness that until Democrats and liberals reckon with, they're going to continue to make these kind of poor judgment decisions over and over again.
Absolutely. And to be fair, I'm always calling on Republicans to grapple with why Trump lost in 2020.
Sure.
It's like, are you growing the coalition by engaging in some of the crazy things Trump says that clearly most of the electorate has no appetite for? So I'm constantly calling on Republicans to have this introspection. Could Democrats have this introspection as well? It would be marvelous if they could.
They got to.
All right. Well, that does it for this segment. We'll have more Rising right after this.